on this episode of Pilot Nerds.
What the f*** is my oil so hot for? That is just getting hotter. Okay, we gotta land now.
We're doing a deep dive into the engine data of two similar, yet very different emergencies.
Epic.
The oil just went to 250.
Oh,
This is bad.
uh-oh. Are you idle? That's what.
Yeah, dude, we're going idle, man.
Each of these flights have their own dedicated episodes on the Flight Shop's YouTube channel, but I felt the analysis we did here was so rich that it was worthy of its own episode, so that's what we did. Go Pilot Nerds.
So, what are we all here to talk about? We're here to talk about myths, and we're gonna bust some myths. We're gonna also infringe on some copyright.
No, we're Pilot Nerds.
Pilot nerds, right, sorry. It's interesting because there's kind of two things that cropped up looking at that emergency footage is that there's I guess we can call it a myth that you're going to see some kind of oil temperature to pressure correlation, which sounds pretty plausible. Oil gets thinner, pressure comes down, right?
I've definitely been told this.
Yeah, sure, right. And the other one is, I think, a little more fringe, is that you're going to see a strong correlation between oil temperature runaway and your cylinder head temperatures. And that one, I think, is a little more far-fetched for me, personally. And we have a lot of crazy good data here because we have an example of an actual runaway oil condition where the scat tube disconnected from the airplane. We got problems.
Oh no.
About halfway through the test flight, oil temperature started climbing and it hit 252. Out of nowhere. Like the oil cooler has to be blocked by something. So the oil temperature did exceed the maximum permissible red line by quite a bit.
You know what it could also be?
Scat tubing
It's not connected?
came on. Look at it, it's blown off.
Yeah.
That'll do it and create that absolute runaway condition that I knew was happening. That's not data that you normally collect because nobody's willing to go out and test that.
Yeah, that's awesome that you guys got that because it's like, yeah, who's going to go up and be like, okay, we're going to shoot for 260 today?
And oil, let's be fair to oil manufacturers. Like that stuff can take a lot, and I firmly believe that if it got really, really, really hot, like 290, 300, like race cars do hit those temperatures, and they can probably keep going for quite amount of time. But like how long is totally ambiguous, and what shape is your engine going to be when you land? That's also, you want to put 1,000 hours of wear inside of an hour. That's the kind of thing that you're talking about, right? And then not a couple weeks later, Steve goes out and proves that you can cause the same anomaly in a totally different way, which is a very Steve thing to do. So anyway, I got my screen shared up here. I got some pretty cool charts to talk about. Because everybody loves a good chart. This is data from both flights, mostly my actual runaway condition. Like I'll call it, they're both emergencies in my opinion. I do not want to call the other flight a fake emergency because it's not a fake emergency until you're on the ground and determine, it was instrumentation. Both emergencies, one was an actual runaway, one was a false indication. So this is my flight's oil temperature versus pressure, okay? This is the start. The far left of the chart is when the scat tube popped off. I was running at a continuous 210. I had just come out of slow flight and stabilized handling. And then I was into a high-speed pass. The oil was at 210. And this is not a representation of time, although this took place over about 35 seconds. This is a representation of, for every degree the oil temperature increased, what was the pressure reading? And in the very, very important part, is what was the engine speed, and it was constant because I was in a high-speed pass. I was configured for 2,600 RPM, and what was the oil pressure, because it's very dependent on both mostly engine speed and then secondarily oil temperature, as you're going to see. So at 210 we're at 78 psi, and then 5 degrees above the maximum on the far right of the chart we're at 76 psi. That is a 2 psi delta. We didn't even drop from 78 to 77 until 228. And then hitting the maximum was only 1 pound out from 210. Are you going to use that data to determine if you have an actual high temperature condition? I would say absolutely not. You've triggered the maximum at 235 at 77 psi, and you're down to 76. And you might say, well, I really know my engine. I always run at 78. Well, here's a chart showing that same flight, okay? Engine RPM versus oil pressure in some slow speed handling. So I had a nice consistent, I haven't labeled the chart here yet, but it's 211 degrees, so very close to the same temperature. And this is various engine speeds while I'm approaching the stall. look at this wacky trend. I've got lows at 55 psi and highs at almost 80 across 1290 to 2490 or so at RPM. So the RPM is the major influencer on that pump, because the pump is running at the speed the engine is running at, and the oil is going to move through it based on that speed. So this makes perfect sense. So you really can't say...
Look at those low data points, like every...
Yeah,
100 RPM
it wasn't
too.
even consistent.
Are you
right?
shifting?
Right. Those low data points, I think, are mostly on spool up. So it hasn't, like, the engine's still responding to the changes in power. So this wasn't a very linear, slow transition from 1300 RPM to 2400. This was probably a little herky-jerky, so you see some lows. But the important thing is kind of interpolating a point that goes across that. It is very driven by engine RPM. So you're just going to tell me, like, oh, well, I've got the engine RPM, so yeah, you can't say that you know within a pound on a given RPM. Like you'd need to be so intimately close to your engine.
Well, that's got to be really close to the threshold of tolerance, the error margin for the sensors even.
Yeah, that's probably within the error margin of the sensor. And let's take this with the fact that we've got a G3X, which is showing us 1-digit increments.
Yeah, imagine me flying the Archer around.
Right. What is one tick of movement?
Needle
on that
that's
thing?
like, oh, it's in the green. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's square, the square instrument there. And just to be clear, the concept of oil pressure and temperature is the one failure mode where you lost your oil, like it drained out. That's the one everyone thinks of, right? It's like, okay, I guess that's a case where it's going to get hot and the pressure's going to drop. That
is a very fair case.
It's going to be a dramatic oil pressure drop, though.
And that's totally fair. The pressure is going to be wildly unstable. I have actually had an emergency early on in flight training where the airplane did shed all of its oil all over itself. And the pressure was the first indication that was noticed, because it was one of those little rectangular Cessna 172 tiny instruments, but it had an annunciator light. And it came on and I said, that's weird. And the pressure was really bottoming out. But even the visual resolution on that instrument was maybe 10 psi. Like, I don't know that I would notice visually on that thing a 10 psi delta. So, the G3X, sure, you're going to look at that 1 pound difference, but I just don't think that's a realistic scenario to make a decision where you're in that emergency at 240 degrees and you're going to go, I'm going to let this thing run in steady state for a while and just kind of see what happens next from with my oil pressure. No, you're going to make the decision to go to an airport and land the airplane. Next point is even more, I think, obvious, is that this cylinder head temperature idea, that there's going to be a correlation there, is, in my opinion, fairly ridiculous. So here is a 90-second sample from when my scat tube disconnected, and then 90 seconds from there. And here's the oil temperature starting at 210 and reaching a high of 243. These cylinder head temperatures are all completely and totally normal. 339 to 346. Most of this change was from accelerating after the slow flight into a hotter condition for the cylinder heads. This is pretty easy to explain, right? The engine is a 300-pound mass of aluminum. The cylinder heads are making tremendous amounts of heat in combustion. The idea that the 6 quarts of oil, which weighs, anybody remember what's a quart of oil weigh? Man, I can't recall off the top of my head.
No, about...
No.
Pilot nerds are failing miserably on that one. Not very much. A small percentage of that engine's thermal mass is oil.
All right, it weighs 28 ounces.
To see a connection here, the idea that you would see some kind of correlation in CHTs to oil temperature in this kind of a scenario, like, there's no way you would cross-reference this data.
Well, I love having this because it's logical to think that, and the people that were commenting that it was fair. But here's the data to say, no, that's not something you can possibly use to diagnose.
I've absolutely been told that. I've absolutely been told that when having that thought experiment. What do you do? Like, how do you know if it's an instrumentation problem?
Well, it's interesting you raise that point, because we have this data here for the two together, because we've managed to produce an instrumentation problem and an actual problem on the same airplane inside of the same time span.
You're like a microcosm of aviation, just rapidly traveling through time faster than the rest of us.
It's almost like we rigged it. I think it's completely rigged. I think this Flight Shops channel is totally bogus.
It's awesome that we got this.
Yeah, so this is great. Here is 90 seconds of both emergencies, from when they start to 90 seconds out.
You're using up all of the luck for the three of us, Steve.
Yeah, well, I'm sharing the love so we can learn from it.
I think this is great. So you see kind of an anomaly here in a slight variation of pressure at the or temperature. This is all temperature in Fahrenheit on both oil for both flights. And you got kind of a representation of the operating red line across the graph here. So Steve's got a dip followed by an insane, impossible increase, right, during this G load. And he's not looking here. This is the worst scenario. He's not looking. He never saw 280 because he's in the middle of a loop. Like your eyes are outside. It's the worst time. And I've got this very kind of slow linear increase where things are slowly, very stably running away. The problem is if you, as the operator of the aircraft, notice at this intersection, say that's when you glance, is at this intersection. Well, from that trend point on, our emergencies look very similar. Like they're very stabilized, high, above red line oil temperatures. So the handling of this as an emergency was absolutely appropriate. And especially primed with the information that this just happened weeks prior.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was certain it was a scat tube again. Absolutely.
I would have been absolutely certain, and I would have been absolutely flabbergasted at the fact that it wasn't later.
Right, yeah.
There you go. Like the data supports all of this. And like you've got all of this to show that when you have an instrument that is red, going through some thought exercise that you're going to pull out some analytical kung fu in that moment and be like, I'm going to start, you just watch the gif of like the math symbols moving by, like while you're in the emergency, like that is not appropriate. That is not good aviation decision making. It's not good airmanship. And yes, the appropriate reaction is to divert to the nearest airport urgently. And if you need to, declare the emergency. Neither of us really had a scenario where we needed to say the word emergency or mayday. We would have if we had to, right?
Right, yeah, your situation was an uncontrolled airport where you own the airspace. You made the call to say, I think you said something like landing immediate you made the traffic call. There was no one there, like it didn't matter, but you did the call. And for me, I was already talking to ATC with a direct plan to go straight in with a tailwind, and they approved it, and there was no arguing. So, I had the brief possibility of having to argue about a keep your speed up because there's a jet behind you situation, but that didn't become a problem, and if it did, I would have declared. So, yeah, it's a balancing act of when do you need to versus when do you just need to keep that out of your way. Like if you look at the Miracle on the Hudson, Sully said something like, I'm going to end up on the Hudson when he got offered to Teterboro and all these other things ATC was trying to help him out with. He just said unable, and then he stopped talking.
Yeah, that's totally the way that should be handled, because if you had said, I have an emergency, you would have been answering a series of stupid questions that were, great for paperwork later, but you had to get on the ground, and that's what the priority was, and you were sequenced appropriately, and everything worked out, right? So that's really kind of a debate for couch pilots.
Well, I had someone say to me it was a serious failure to not use the pan-pan call, and my response was, or was it a technical failure? Because yes, if that was a test question, it would have been a fail to not use the pan-pan call in my situation anyways, where I did have ATC listening to me. In your situation, it wouldn't have probably mattered because no one would have answered because there's no one on frequency.
No, there was no one listening. I wasn't on I was on the airport's common traffic frequency. Serious failure, I have never heard a pan-pan call ever. I've heard a number of emergency calls.
Yeah, I've always wondered has anyone ever made an emergency call and been like, dang, I wish I would have called pan-pan. Right. I've also heard if it's not you, like pan-pan is maybe something someone would call hey, I heard this guy just take off from this airport, and this happened to me in Oklahoma, and then he was like, guys, I think I'm on fire. And that ended up being he had smoke coming from his gear motor.
So somebody else did a pan-pan to relay it.
No, but I imagine that would be the kind of scenario that they have in mind when they're when I've heard it's someone else makes the pan-pan call.
Right.
Like that guy had an emergency.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of those things that it's like this. That is an absolute armchair quarterbacking statement. When you're in the airplane, all you need to convey is accurate urgency. And if there's follow-up questions or some debate about the urgency, then you can immediately just say this is an emergency, period. But
That's it, yeah.
I have had multiple what I would constitute as an emergency and not use the word emergency, where it's just like, I have this issue, a very quick synopsis. I have an indication, I have a bad instrument indication in the cockpit, I need to land immediately.
They always answer with, do you need assistance? They always get it. In your case with the RV8, they asked you, are you going to need assistance? And even for my situation, they asked me, am I going to need assistance on the ground, right? They understood, like, there's something going on, so they're getting primed and ready. And maybe they're secretly declaring the emergency in the background for you, which is something that ATC will do when they predict that they think that's what is going on. And they kind of are wise enough to realize, we don't need to load this guy up with it, but let's get the trucks standing by if we think that's what this is.
Yeah, and if you say, like, need to land immediately, right, that's kind of unambiguous.
It's hard to argue with, and frankly, if they do argue, then you just pull the emergency card out, and the unable card or the emergency card, it's all yours.
Yeah, and for me, honestly, if the questions, if there becomes some kind of debate about the emergency, and I'm not getting what I want, I'm just going to stop talking to you, and I'm going to land the airplane.
There's that, yeah.
If I have to land on a taxiway, I'm going to land on a taxiway. This is not a debate, right? Like this is I need to get the airplane on the ground, and it's always gone totally fine with just a statement of urgency, and that's not technically correct either, right? If this is an emergency, I should say Mayday. I should do the 3 Maydays and the verbal diarrhea, and I have this many souls on board, and I have this much fuel, and that's just too much information for the kind of stuff that we're talking about. But one more thing I wanted to point out that I kind of missed earlier that you can maybe intercut is the CHT thing. When you look at CHTs, like we're talking about how oil temperature or oil pressure versus engine speed is such a massive thing in relationship, right? The biggest thing that relates to CHTs is the richness of the mixture and the engine power. So again, like you have to leave everything in this insane steady state configuration and let it just fly ballistically in this red zone and watch the CHTs and go, oh man, I think there's a trend changing, which could take, well, you're never going to see it.
Well, yeah, we have the data to show. That's pretty interesting.
We have 90 seconds of the data because neither of us were in a position where we felt like just running this scenario.
We need to go for another circle.
Right. Yeah.
Hey, this is Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Actually, let me make it pan and pan because this is good data.
One thought also for me, knowing now that mine wasn't real, the issue of shock cooling came up. Like, I really did pull an engine back to idle that didn't need to be pulled back to idle, that I wouldn't have done in normal situations. Like, I guess because it's tightly cowled, it didn't shock cool it, but it could have. I don't know, you want to address that?
I kind of do want to address that. I think that to start that discussion, there are some very wide extremes in what is considered appropriate operating parameters or the deltas for the change over time of what's acceptable. Like if you look at some of the Mooney operating manuals, they're like, oh, you got to reduce the manifold pressure 1 inch per
every
minute.
2 minutes.
Like
yeah, something like that.
That's absolutely sounds insane to me because I could take that same engine in an aerobatic airplane and just, loop it and then pull the throttle to idle in the down back end of a loop. Like, look at people that fly acro in something like a Citabria, right? It's a cowled engine
with a fixed pitch.
Or even Andre dumping skydivers.
You're wide open throttle going up the hill, and then you're absolutely idle and accelerating downhill in the dead of winter. And it's like, are you shock cooling the engine? Well, yeah, you are. But I don't really think there's this tremendous relationship around, really detrimental damage for something like that versus, like, are you really gonna crack a cylinder doing this? Is there some really bad thing that's going to happen to the engine pulling it back to idle, especially in the RV14, which is pretty tightly cowled and has, I could have pulled a chart showing your CHTs. Did you shock cool it? Not really. I mean, it takes a while for them to get back down to 300 degrees.
Well, that and also the OAT. Like, if you're up in a Mooney flying at 18,000, where it is like, minus 12 Celsius, then maybe we're talking about a situation where that is applicable.
Yeah, it was a hot day, right? Like,
yeah. Both of our yours was a really hot day.
Yeah, mine was an insanely hot day.
Mine was a warm day. It wasn't like roasting like it was in Alabama for you. I think the amount of sweat coming off the back of your neck in my footage is pretty impressive.
It was hot.
Legitimately, that level of heat I could feel it impacting my mental state.
Pre-takeoff was already completed, but we're going to put the boost pump on now.
You've seen me in a few scenarios that were probably as bad as that, and I don't think I've ever said to myself out loud, you got to work the problem. And that was like a mental trigger that I'm like, I feel foggy, like I need to just verbally, I need to work the problem. And I feel like I was just so hot, kind of getting dehydrated. And I don't think I was as sharp as I normally would be in those scenarios.
And it didn't help that you hadn't flown the airplane for 3 months. I don't know how many.
Yeah, right. As long as it had been there.
Lots of good data on that one.
Well, that's what the Flight Chops channel is all about, you know, and Pilot Nerds. It's all about data. It's about data analysis and pretending like we know what we're talking about.
It was interesting you got this data. It was kind of prescient. Dave and I were talking about a month before any of this happened. I was out just doing air work and being like, you know, I'm going to, instead of just practicing engine outs, because isn't it lovely if your engine just quits? I mean, that sounds kind of silly, but, you know, if you don't have any ambiguity then, but like, what if I get one of these contraindications? So my thought experiment there was I'm flying around over Mystic Lake, simulated, okay, I'm reading, you know, high oil temp or low oil pressure or something like that. That could be instrumentation. It could be real. My nearest airport, and now I'm over a bunch of fields that are real nice, you know, even a decent road, and then I have to fly over over trees and neighborhoods for 10 minutes to get to the nearest airport. And there's not another nearest airport that's over more hospitable path there. So that's why I was asking Dave, like, what would you do?
What do you do in that scenario, right? You have the option of these great fields. And you don't know if it's instrumentation. You can't prove if it's instrumentation. And your options for real airports are over terrain you don't want to fly over, or you got these fields. That is one of those decisions to make in the air you just don't want. And I've always said that. If I have a catastrophic emergency, I want the airplane to be covered in its own parts. Like, I want stuff flying through the cowl. It's like, oh, this is a real obvious problem, right?
Right, because I got accused by a couple people of trying to save the engine. And it's like, the decision tree for what I had to deal with, save the engine or save ourselves, was pretty similar. I mean,
it's identical.
I need to get the airplane to run stably while I try to limp myself to an airport which isn't glidable. And, you know, yeah, if the engine did blow up on me, I didn't know if I was going to be facing a fire. And if I had a catastrophic failure, now I'm putting it in a field with these super duper low profile wheel pants, which probably mean we're flipping over.
I know the environment. I know exactly where you were doing the acro because I go to the same spot. First of all, you did not have an airport within gliding range. There just isn't one there. Not even close, right? You got lots of fields, but again, yeah, you're right. That airplane is not suited to land in an unmanicured field. And you had a very simple decision to make. You had an operating parameter outside of the limits of the operational manual that you don't know. You're now a test pilot. The airplane's in a state that the engine will maybe keep running forever, or maybe it will stop in the next 5 minutes. And you went back to your home airport, which you know and I know, but not everybody watching knows, is full of fields between, you know, that location that you were at and getting back to Windsor. So the tree was identical. The decision tree was the same, whether you were helping and ironically, saving yourself relied heavily on you saving the engine.
Yeah.
So I reject that point.
We were even thinking that, you know, in the case of like the scat tubing thing, it would be realistically possible to lower the engine output and still fly enough that you're actually not going to overheat the oil.
Yeah, I don't know, right? Like, and it would be really interesting to take an airplane like that, or just an engine like that, and run the oil up to 300 degrees and just see how long it makes 65% power for with 300 degree oil. Because I believe quite firmly that it would run for quite a long time with very insanely hot oil. The oil's going to be crap. The engine's going to suffer extreme scarring, most likely. But, you know, I just remember those old Valvoline commercials from the 90s where they had the two engines running, and when they drained the oil out of both and the one kept running. I mean, the reality is they do run for quite a while with hot oil. And I mean, obviously in my scenario, I firmly believed it was a runaway oil temperature, and it was. And you can accuse me all you want, I was saving the engine. I was over the airport. The whole envelope of that test flight was over the airport. It was an easy decision, very simple. I'm going to land right now, and I'm going to close the throttle in attempts to mitigate, you take away the bang, the 16 or the 1500 degree combustion, and the oil temperature is probably going to come down as long as you keep the speed up. Thankfully, I just had a really easy decision tree in that. You had a much harder one, honestly.
But I'm happy with how it played out. What my failure though was that I didn't leverage my tools. I didn't use the autopilot. Like, I knew Chatham was an option, Leamington was an option, and Windsor was an option. I knew none of them were gliding distance. If I was really on top of my game, I probably would have pressed direct to nearest. But then I also knew in my brain, it's probably going to show me all these, there's a bunch of grass strips nearby. I don't want to start filtering out grass strips that I'm not familiar with, and I don't know what the condition, like, that went through my head for a second, and I was like, I just held onto the stick and just kept hand flying. I didn't.
Plus, you were probably 10 minutes from Windsor, right? So
I was focusing on just what power settings can I play with here to get this oil to a place where it will keep running.
And your indications came down, even though they were wrong. They came down to a level that would be like.
They were completely wrong. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, they're wrong the whole. Well, they continued to be wrong for the entire rest of that flight by. Like,
and the next day.
And, well, that's right, until we jiggled it. Yeah, but the number I know I saw was 258. I remember that was the number I saw. And that was sure.
It's startling.
I guess another thing to talk about is the health data that I have for Andre and I. Both of us had a heart rate drop after the incident, which is quite interesting. I've got a cardiologist fan that kind of saw that data and gave me some detailed insights. That's worth a whole other thing. But I think that'd be an interesting discussion, because it seems like when you actually know what you're doing, you kind of handle it calmly. Like, you get into the zone, like what you talked about, like work the problem. You're not panicking and flailing. You're actually cold and calculated. And that's definitely where both of us got. And that was kind of cool to see that in the data. So that's a whole other discussion that I think we'll get into in a future episode. And if you're still here, thanks for sticking around to the end. Please let me know in the comments what you'd like to see us do with this channel. I just thought it was worthy of its own format outside the scope of what I'm doing with Flight Shops. So until next time, keep your pilot nerdy.